Hello, welcome to Inside Politics. My name is Anastasiya Lavrina. On January 16, President of the United States, Donald Trump, announced the creation of the Board of Peace, a mechanism regarded in Washington as phase 2 of his comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict, a 20-point roadmap for reconstruction, stability and long-term prosperity. Among the first governments to be invited was the Republic of Azerbaijan, and not merely as a participant, but as a founding member state of the organization. On Wednesday, Baku confirmed that it had accepted Trump's invitation. For Washington, the choice is strategic. Azerbaijan brings a proven record in post-conflict reconstruction, confidence-building diplomacy, and the ability to translate political agreements into infrastructure, humanitarian delivery, and restored connectivity, elements essential for any sustainable settlement. The initiative will formally launch on January 22. Building on the comprehensive plan unveiled last September and endorsed through United Nations Security Council Resolution 2803. The board's mandate is to synchronize reconstruction resources, coordinate donor states and monitor implementation, with the United States retaining veto authority over all decisions. Participation remains mixed. France has opted out for now. Several European capitals remain cautious, while states such as Israel, Albania, Armenia, Belarus, Hungary, Kazakhstan, Morocco and Vietnam have confirmed involvement. In total, invitations were extended to 58 leaders, illustrating that the stakes are not limited to Gaza, but touch the geopolitical architecture of the wider Middle East. Even Russian President Vladimir Putin has been invited to join the board. So the central question becomes, will reconstruction serve as a platform for regional stability or evolve into yet another arena for geopolitical competition between great and middle powers? Joining me now is Tom Gross, political analyst from Tel Aviv, Israel, and Richard Hoagland, retired U.S. ambassador from Washington, D.C., United States of America. Dear experts, welcome to Inside Politics. Thank you so much for being with us today. And Ambassador Hoagland, let me start with you addressing this question. Before I move to the Board of Peace initiative, let me also refer to the recently made speech by Donald Trump in Davos. He gave a radical speech, I would say. To what extent does he see foreign policy as interconnected rather than regional, linking Europe, NATO, the Middle East and Asia?
Thank you very much for the question. And I'll tell you, that's a rather hard question to answer, and it's only speculation. It seems as if President Trump's interests lie in whatever makes a big headline in the international media. I know that sounds a little bit crude, but it seems that that's the way it goes, because sometimes the follow-up isn't there. But in any case, we hope that this will move forward in the right direction.
So, Mr. Gross, if Trump reframes NATO and Europe in transactional terms, how does that affect United States strategies in the Middle East?
Well, let me just, first of all, just follow up on what the ambassador said. Although I agree that Trump is, of course, a showman and he's interested in headlines and he sometimes doesn't follow up on things. For example, he removed Maduro in Venezuela and then he switched to the topic of Greenland without following up, or he threatened to hit the Iranian regime and so far he hasn't followed up. At the same time, I think we're being a bit unfair. I think Trump is actually pretty serious about thinking outside the box on most major international issues, including the Middle East, Greenland, Iran, NATO, South America, and so on. And I think that, in a way, the Europeans and the existing diplomatic order in the United Nations are too much looking at the last war. Trump is some steps ahead, looking at what might happen in future. Before I come to the Middle East, if I could just quickly say about Greenland, he's looking at the threats that might come from missiles and such from the north, whereas the Europeans are still looking at Russian tanks coming into Poland from the east. And we shouldn't dismiss Trump too easily. So going to the Middle East, he did get the Abraham Accords, 4 peace deals with Israel and 4 Arab countries in his first term. His Gaza Board of Peace, which is going to be signed into existence tomorrow morning at Davos, he's invited a whole number of countries. It's not quite clear yet which countries are ready to accept to join this Board of Peace. It seems on the face of it a bit muddled, but what I've learned is if you strip away Trump's language and his sometimes insulting language to other world leaders or to President Biden or even other American politicians, there is some strategic thought there. And I think he does have some play that he's proposing for Gaza, yes.
Well, now the question about the creation of Board of Peace. Ambassador, what does this initiative reveal about how post-conflict diplomacy is evolving in the Middle East from ceasefires and crisis management to long-term reconstruction and institutional mechanism?
I think our colleague sort of hit the nail on the head. This is a president of the United States who doesn't necessarily follow past precedent, who thinks in new ways, and has surrounded himself with people that he can trust rather than professionals who are linked totally to the past. Now, that leaves everything as an open question then, because it means we've moved into a new historic period. And whether that continues remains to be seen. But in specifics for about the Middle East, the President of the United States has said for quite a long time that he wants to be involved in finding a permanent peace. He also wants to be involved in reconstructing the Gaza landmass for future success and future economic prosperity. So I think what we need to do is step back just a bit and see what are the options that are available and do they really make sense? If they make sense, then the nations will move forward together. If they don't really make sense, then there will be more questions to be asked.
Excellent points, Ambassador. So, Mr. Gross, for 2 decades, Gaza diplomacy was driven by bilateral deals, humanitarian corridors, and short-term crisis intervention. Is this initiative the first attempt to move toward a structured multilateral framework?
Well, the main problem for Gaza in the last 2 decades was that it was run by Hamas, who seized power from Fatah, executed, that's the rival Palestinian faction, and spent a great deal of their resources and energy building up arsenals of rockets to fire at Israel, or building up a quite impressive, from a structural point of view, underground tunnel network. And what you need for Gaza to move forward is for Hamas to no longer rule Gaza, and to have a governing authority there that is interested in building up a successful entity that wants to enjoy peaceful relations with its Israeli neighbor, not one that wants to fight perpetual jihad. So the Trump peace plan, the ceasefire that was announced last year, the first stage of, I think it's 18-point plan, was that Hamas would disarm. As of now, Hamas have not disarmed, quite the contrary. They've actually been executing political opponents and so on, and they've been rearming with guns and guns and other weapons smuggled in by drone from Egypt and through some existing tunnels. So there are reports in the Saudi media that some senior Hamas leaders from Gaza have agreed to now leave the Gaza Strip and go and live elsewhere, presumably Qatar or maybe Turkey. But that remains to be seen. As long as Hamas are in control on the ground, even if Gaza is rebuilt, that won't necessarily lead to peace. You have to have governments in Gaza and indeed in Israel that want to have peace. And no amount of goodwill or wishful desire by Trump or anyone else in the international community is going to make peace if you don't have a government in Gaza that wants peace.
Ambassador, indeed, that's a very important issue raised here. United States officials have hinted that Phase 2 of Trump's plan focuses on reconstruction before settlement, but Israel has historically insisted on demilitarization before reconstruction. Then how can those two philosophies be reconciled?
You've raised a very good point there, and let me say that I'm very grateful for Mr. Gross's comments. I think he really hit the nail on the head. So long as an extremist group like Hamas is in charge, nothing will really change into the future. If Hamas can be, with its allies, sort of moved off to the side, not necessarily destroyed, but moved off to the side so that the people of Palestine and international players can actually take on a serious role in both rebuilding structurally what has been destroyed, but also in setting up a reliable government that can do business with Tel Aviv, that can do business with the Arab countries, that can do business with the capitals of the world. That would be a really big change, and that would begin to cement peace for the future. But the economic growth is going to be terribly, terribly important because it's the connectivity of economic links from country to country, group to group, that really do begin to guarantee peace for the future. We've seen this in other places in the world, most recently, for example, in Karabakh, in Azerbaijan. Building connectivity with former enemies begins to build a strong basis for peace. The most important thing for building peace in Gaza is economic reconstruction, because when there are links, economic links among groups, among peoples, among nations, then there is more of a guarantee of peace, because everyone wants to move forward economically and benefit the people. We saw an example of that very recently in Karabakh in Azerbaijan, beginning to build economic links with Armenia and others, builds a kind of connectivity that begins to lay the foundation for a strong peace for the future. Let us hope that that is where we are with Gaza right now, at the very beginning of building those economic connectivity links that will guarantee peace for the future.
Ambassador Hoagland, you raised a very important issue, which I was about to ask you. How significant is it that Azerbaijan joins as a founding member state? Does they signal a bigger role for emerging middle powers in the post-conflict diplomacy?
I think the most important thing that we are seeing here is building connectivity links in the economy. Because when there are links among groups, among peoples, among nations, economic links, then there is less possibility of violence and destruction in the future, because people want to maintain their economic growth. They want to be positive for the future. They want a positive future for their children and for their grandchildren. So let's hope, even though we're at the very earliest stages, that this moves forward in a proper way that benefits the people of Gaza, benefits the Palestinian people, and eventually all of its neighbors.
Absolutely. Mr. Gross, in continuation of this topic, Baku's reconstruction of Karabakh emphasized connectivity, smart cities and logistics. Can the model be transferred to Gaza, or would Gaza require a different paradigm?
Well, just following up what the ambassador said, of course, economic prosperity is crucial for peace and good relations. However, in the case of Gaza, economic investment is the least of worries. I mean, for example, Qatar, which has been very involved with Gaza, spent about as much on the last World Cup, the last Football World Cup, as would cost to rebuild the whole of Gaza. Gaza's population is only about 2 million. The problem in Gaza is political Islam, is jihad. It's not economics. There was, in fact, a fairly good life in Gaza, despite lots of the Western media depiction of it before the recent war. There were shopping malls. A friend of mine from the Financial Times said that he stayed in the nicest hotel in the Middle East he'd stayed in was in Gaza, not in Dubai. So it's not about money. Money is available quite easily in the Middle East from countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar. The problem is you have to have a government in Gaza that does care about the well-being of its own children. And I would argue that Hamas doesn't. In fact, it's quite happy to sacrifice them in the name of a kind of Islamic jihad. And the ideological problem there is the biggest problem, not an economic one.
Mr. Gross, one more question to you. Is it possible to separate reconstruction from governance, or will rebuilding inevitably produce new political actors and institutions in Gaza?
No, rebuilding by itself won't produce anything. To remind your viewers, there have been smaller wars between Hamas and Israel, about 4 of them in 2009, 2012, 2018, 2021. There was reconstruction after all those wars, and that didn't lead to peace. Why? Because Hamas was just building up an ever greater arsenal of hundreds of thousands of rockets and other weapons to try and kill Israeli civilians and invade Israel. So obviously you also need a government in Israel that wants peace, but I think the majority of Israelis would welcome peaceful and good relations with Palestinians in Gaza. But Hamas, it's not in their DNA to do state building. And look, it is possible for Islamists to change. It's quite possible that the new leader of Syria, President Shara, previously a militant Islamist, is going to emerge as a respectable statesman interested in state building. But the jury's out in Syria, and at least al-Shara has made indications and convinced people like President Trump that he wants to be a serious leader. Hamas are not even pretending to want to be serious statesman-like, state-building, governing force. They immediately, after the ceasefire, went about summarily executing political opponents in a very public way to show Gazans who's boss, and again, siphoning off aid and money and so on. They're a corrupt and jihadi-like organization. So you can reconstruct buildings, but they won't lead to peace without a government that wants peace.
Ambassador, Washington insists it retains a veto authority over decisions. Is that designed to ensure efficiency or ensure control?
I think that's a very good question, and I don't think it can be answered at this point. Probably a good number of people would say it leans toward control, because the president that we have in Washington right now is very strongly in favor of his personal control of any kind of issue that crosses his desk. Now, that's not anything necessarily negative. If things are done in the right way, then that's wonderful. Let me say that I fully agree with what Mr. Gross has just said about Hamas, because for peace, long-term peace in the future, rather than an ideological group that is strongly in control, what's important is that realpolitik takes hold. And realpolitik means doing the right thing at the right time, day by day, whether it's part of an ideology or not. When things are stuck in ideology, they tend to go wrong. That's been my experience, at least, in 40 years of diplomacy.
Ambassador, then if we are talking about big politics, Donald Trump also sent the invitation to Vladimir Putin to join this initiative. And if Russia joins the board, does it increase legitimacy or introduce geopolitical friction?
Again, an absolutely excellent question. And that would be hard to answer because from the Western point of view, from the American point of view, Putin is in hot water, to be very frank, because of his war against Ukraine and his threat to other former Soviet socialist republics. So it remains to be seen. It could be that our current president here in Washington has a long-term vision that looks into the future and sees a positive role for the president of Russia. But there are an awful lot of people these days who would say, oh my God, this is going to be a problem. We have to wait and see how it develops.
Mr. Grossman, one more question to you. Can the United States pressure Europe economically and still expect alignment on security and reconstruction issues?
Well, I think, look, Donald Trump's a very unusual figure, and he can be very bombastic and rude. But I think when you look at his actual worldview, he's quite forward-looking, and he's right about a lot of issues. And it's Europe that's sort of stuck in the past. I mean, why should America pay for everything without getting more control? Who is going to defend Europe without the US? Who is going to defend Greenland without the US? Who's going to defend Middle Eastern states, which is why Middle Eastern allies of America, like the UAE and the Saudis, they understand the need to be grateful and cooperate and help pay for American defense and support. And I think Europeans should understand that too. Europe's a rich continent. It's numerically bigger than the US. And I think, Trump's got a point when he says, if you're not going to put money into it, why should we do things? I also think that Europe is slightly stuck in the past. It's playing by rules of international law which it makes up. So it will criticize, for example, Trump for grabbing Maduro in Venezuela. But at the same time, it said they've made up international laws to arrest the American ally, the Prime Minister of Israel, were he to set foot in France or Britain. So Prime Minister Netanyahu cannot presently set foot in countries like Britain or France. And America is saying, you have to back us. If you want help with your defense, you better come on board generally with an America first point of view, or American leadership point of view. And I think it's about a dialogue with Europe, but I think he's shaking things up, and it's necessary to shake things up. And Europe shouldn't just go off in a huff or be insulted by Trump's very strong language sometimes. They should engage him and think outside the box about a future world where China and Russia and others are the real threat, and they have to get on board with it.
Well, dear expert, thank you. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks to you. Very good questions, as always.
Thank you very much. Well, that's clear that post-conflict diplomacy in the Middle East is entering a new phase. One where reconstruction is no longer treated as a humanitarian task, but as a geopolitical instrument. The Board of Peace may succeed provided it secures legitimacy, participation, and trust. But legitimacy in this region is rarely granted. It's earned through outcomes on the ground, not declarations on paper. As invitations continue to circulate, the true test will be whether major powers choose cooperation over rivalry, and whether regional actors see reconstruction not as a bargaining chip, but as a long-term investment in stability. We'll be watching closely. This is Inside Politics. I'm Anastasiya Lavrina. Until next time.